Right, well, let's talk about the COVID inquiry right now. Some of us were of the view the COVID inquiry was just going to be, should we have locked down 2 weeks earlier? Maybe there's a bit more hope with the appointment of Baroness Hallett, the chair of the inquiry. She has demanded that the government provides all of Boris Johnson's messages sent on WhatsApp during the pandemic era. The key thing is that she had wanted them by 4 o'clock yesterday, but that was extended to 4 o'clock tomorrow now. But the government has been accused of a cover-up after basically saying they don't want to hand them over. Last night it emerged that the government's top lawyer had told the Cabinet Office not to hand over any politically sensitive details of policy discussions between ministers during the pandemic, except isn't all of it politically sensitive because it could impact on what we think of those ministers given the policy discussions they would have had. Boris Johnson, we're told, has said, well, I'm happy to hand them over. It's the government that won't. Is it Rishi Sunak who's responsible for that decision? Let's talk about all of this with Robert Lord Hayward. He's a Conservative peer and joins us now. Good morning to you.
Good morning, Julia.
Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Is this a cover-up?
No, it's probably government operates either on the capacity of a conspiracy, stroke cover-up, or an alternative phrase, which I'm not willing to use on television.
I'm going to say it, cock-up, and it nearly always is cock-up.
You can say it, but I'm not.
Okay, but this is the thing. I accept that it's nearly always hopelessness and incompetence rather than anything else, and I consider that across the board in government and indeed in pretty much organisations as well. However, you know, we saw what came out of Matt Hancock's WhatsApps in the lockdown files, and we learnt an awful lot. Though, as Isabel Oakeshott pointed out to me on our show yesterday, that actually had not handed over to her the WhatsApps from May 2020. We wonder why, unless perhaps they are ones that he'd already been offered to the COVID inquiry and he'd been told not to hand them elsewhere. We don't know. But the key thing is very simple. I mean, this is can you hand them over? Here you go. I mean, there's nothing complicated about this, surely.
Well, it may seem simple, uncomplicated, but in fact it's not. And we go back to previous legislation over the last few decades, and that is that governments can communicate with each other to develop policy, and that is exempt, for example, from Freedom of Information Acts and the like. And this is what the government is trying to protect, while at the same time apparently trying to make information available to the COVID inquiry. My suspicion is that by the time we get to tomorrow evening, there will have been a way through, because it's not uncommon that documents are provided to certain organisations on conditions of confidentiality, and they may then be published, but with substantial elements redacted.
Yeah.
And I think that's probably the way that we will find by late tomorrow we've got to a conclusion on both sides.
We have seen an awful lot of government documents over the years being published with redactions, and sometimes you end up with, whole sheets of A4 with just black lines across, and we don't get to see anything at all. I mean, look, we're not going to see the unredacted copies. I'm sure at some point in the future, in years and years to come, things will emerge. But it seems to be, the debate seems to be that these were private WhatsApp messages, and we want to decide what's relevant. And Baroness Hallett is saying, I'll decide what's relevant. The reality is, I don't trust the government ministers themselves. I don't trust former ministers. I don't trust the aides or advisors, and I don't trust civil servants or government lawyers to be able to accurately decide what is relevant and what is not. Because actually, what we learned from the Matt Hancock COVID WhatsApps was that an awful lot of the decision-making was completely haphazard and random and came about in sort of private conversations in WhatsApp groups. And actually, someone could argue and say, oh, well, that wasn't really relevant. But actually, that's the most damning stuff. It shows that, as I always suspected, that the decision-making was not based on any science at all. It was based on PR, polling, what would make people look good in their egos, rather than anything else. It's right that the COVID inquiry chair should get to decide what's relevant, surely.
Oh, there's no question that you don't appoint somebody as senior as the person chairing the inquiry without saying to her, look, you will have access to all the relevant documentation. You're not going to have a senior judge, lawyer taking that position with the information being given, oh, well, we'll give you as much as we think is relevant. She will ultimately see what she believes to be relevant. And I think under those circumstances, as I say, there will be a compromise. Government does not like handing information over.
No.
And it is an established principle that government ministers must be able to communicate in confidence over a period of time. But in these circumstances, I think there'll be a compromise.
Well, yes, indeed. I think that's going to have to be the case. But this is the thing. I completely defend the right of governments being able to have, private advice and personal advice. Again, I think legal advice to the government. We have court cases to demand that. There needs to be able to be a free and open conversation where people say, look, this is why we can't do it, because it's a dumb idea, Minister, or, people need to be able to talk freely. However, this is about sort of almost like their privacy to have these conversations. But I don't think that government policy that affects millions of people is hitting us now in terms of excess deaths as a result of failures of the NHS, in terms of the hit to the economy we're going to all feel for decades to come. The fact that they were able to have be able to make decisions that affected whether we could, have someone have our mum in the kitchen or the garden of our home or hug them. It's a bit rich for anyone in government to say, oh, well, these are private conversations. They were able to impose on our private lives in an outrageous and unprecedented way. We have a right to know why those decisions were made, don't we? And if that is at the expense of their privacy, so be it.
I think you've got two conflicting issues here, and this is the problem. On one side, government ministers need to be able to take decisions with a full, free and fair exchange between different government departments without having people chipping in incessantly saying this, that or the other. But at the same time, when you set up an inquiry on an issue as key as the COVID inquiry, you have to say to the people who are handling that inquiry, we will give you the information and we will review it in as open a way as possible.
Yeah, indeed. Let me just play you a very brief clip of the Prime Minister talking about this yesterday.
Well, I think it's really important that we learn the lessons of COVID, and that's why the inquiry was established. And we want to make sure that whatever lessons there are to be learned are learned, and we do that in a spirit of transparency and candour. The government has cooperated with the inquiry. Tens of thousands of documents have been handed over. And with regard to the specific question at the moment, the government's carefully considering its position, but it's confident in the approach that it's taken.
Lord Hayward, we were saying a bit earlier, we weren't sure, given this AI story that's in the news as well, whether AI was involved in that interview or not, because, in fact, the clip goes on and on and on. He basically repeats himself again and again. I've listened to it about 5 times. I still can't work out what he was actually saying, but I think the government's considering its position. But the reality is there are going to be allegations of a cover-up. Lots of people are very untrusting. You've got people on my side of the debate saying, I want to know what happened, why you made such bad decisions. And on the other side, you've got people say, oh, why didn't we lock down sooner and for longer? But either way, we know from just seeing the WhatsApp messages on Matt Hancock's side that it's not going to look good for anyone involved. There is, however, another downside, and that is how long going through, millions and millions of pages of WhatsApps it's going to take, and the delay in us getting to any resolution. We've already been told yesterday, announcement by the COVID inquiry, that they're not taking their first evidence is going to be heard next week, for goodness sake, first public hearing. They've been set up for 2 years, and they're not going to even finish those public hearings until 2026. 3 years' time. We're not going to get a report. Do you know what I mean? Let's face it, the earliest, who are we kidding, 27, 28. Other countries, Sweden, Italy, others, they've done their inquiries, done and dusted, moved on. Is there an argument that we actually need to get all this done a lot sooner?
There is, and I think it is a complex problem. Excuse me. But having said that, you start from the position, and your question starts from a position that you don't trust government and the civil service. And that's generally a British point of view. Whereas I think it's fair to say that some other countries that have already taken the review, excuse me, I'm sorry, they are actually in the position whereby government hands down in a much more authoritarian way than we would accept in this country. This is what happened. We've looked at it. We've come to the decision. And overwhelmingly, government was right. You and other people in this country have a much freer position to challenge government. Society expects government to be challenged. And therefore, it does take somewhat longer. It's too long, but it's inevitable.
There's a balance somewhere between there that's probably right. Lord Hayward, always so good to talk to you. Thank you so much, Conservative peer Lord Hayward. I'll get Tom Slater's thoughts on that. Get some of your texts and tweets coming in thick and fast on that issue. Whose side are you on? Is it a cover-up, COVID inquiries, or the governments have a right to privacy? We'll get to those in just a couple of moments. 7:32 is the time. This is Talk Breakfast.